Is sourdough good for the gut microbiome? It's very interesting because it's a subject that I have been researching and applying the evidence and science to the bread protocol that we teach to our healthcare providers here at the Sourdough School as part of our systems change program that allows doctors to prescribe a sourdough club community membership to their patients so they can learn to make sourdough. And right at the heart of this for me has been nourishing people through bread that is the baseline of what we eat. We evolved with bread, and yet right now bread has never been so confusing, not least because most bread that is eaten now not least because most bread that is eaten now can be considered to be an ultra processed food. And in the Nova food group categorization, we know that refined white carbohydrates and bread that is made in this way is actually associated not just with increased risk of death, but it has also been associated with type 2 diabetes, with obesity, with depression, and, well, I could go on. But essentially, eating a diet full of highly refined carbohydrates, and especially our bread that we eat every day, really lowers the quality of your life. So, what about sourdough? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the major ways in which fermentation can and potentially can transform the bread that we eat every day, whether that be the handmade artisan loaf or the bread that is mass produced in factories, how we can use the lactic acid bacteria and the wild yeast to transform the flour to be less inflammatory and more nourishing. And there are many pathways. When I think about how fermentation transforms the properties, if you like, of bread, it's a little bit like one of those fireworks has gone off in my head, because there are so many pathways that trying to keep it simple and explain it is quite challenging. So I'm going to just cover the basic topics, and of course you can delve a lot deeper. What I will say before I begin is that the transformational property, or properties if you like, of lactic acid bacteria and wild yeast isn't going to transform much if you are using refined white flour. You know, you're pretty much transforming diddly squat. And what you can say about using fermentation on refined white flour is that you're perhaps avoiding things like carbamethylcellulose and any other preservatives or additives that are in the bread. There are huge questions still to be answered on the chemical cocktail of different, I suppose, agrochemicals and baking improvers, if you want. I don't like that word. And the impact on the gut that remain unanswered. I think that's really important to understand. So, yes, the fermentation process is transformative, but you have to start with asking, what are you actually transforming? And so for us here at the Sourdough School, we have worked for many years with some major ingredients manufacturers, and we are also working right now, I'm very excited to say, with some bread manufacturers and bringing our diversity bread system to market. And one hopes that it will support diversity in the gut and diversity in the environment. And that, to me, is the most exciting thing about transforming your ingredients, is that it's the next layer of connection, because our world is microbial. We live on a planet, as any fermenter will know and appreciate, that the top 9 inches of our soil is the planet's gut microbiome. And it is very interesting, some of the studies by Marco Gabbetti on different agricultural system processes and how the microbes in the soil then related to the starter. So before I actually go into the different transformational properties, I want to tell you something that may actually really get you to rethink the way that you think about your ingredients before we even start. One of the major microbes that is heterofermentative, San franciscensis, it is a very interesting microbe that is not actually found in the human gut. All of the other ones are, in some way or another, have been found in related to our gut. But San franciscensis isn't. And that particular microbe really knocks up the acidity in many of the ferments. And part of the acidity in the fermentation is what triggers the enzymes to then do their work. Now, enzymes, I tend to describe them to people as being like Edward Scissorhands, but for each different component of the flour. And they chop up the proteins and the carbohydrate, because of course the carbohydrate needs to be turned into sugar. So it's actually this relationship with these microbes and the acidity levels that trigger many of the processes that are transformative. Now here's what's cool. Where do you think San franciscensis hangs out to get a good meal? Because it's not down at the burger joint. If you're a microbe and you want a really good meal of flour, well, a really great place to start is in the gut of insects that eat flour. So yes, it's found often in frass, which is insect poo, microscopic, please don't panic. So actually, when you start and look at where the microbes are that transform our bread, you automatically make a connection to the soil. And you will learn that the fermentation process and all of those microbes that are what we evolved with and our own gut microbiome are part of a system. And fermentation of bread is the middle of that system in my world, because my dietary intervention studies and I guess pilot studies specifically looked at the impact of our lifestyle medicine approach to bread and the impact of that approach on the gut microbiome. It looked particularly with my medical team here, who gave feedback and analysis to each participant at the changes within what we call the short chain fatty acid producers, which produce butyrate. Now, butyrate is, I guess, a little bit like engine oil, and it's going to coat the lining of your colon. And when you start and understand how the gut works, it's fascinating to understand that when your body gets enough fibre, it is able to produce these metabolites like this short-chain fatty acid butyrate, and that is associated with lower levels of inflammation. So we saw in our participants increases in those levels of butyrate, and Dr. Miguel Matheus here, most incredible gut specialist, and our in-house GP, Dr. Alexandra Davidson, as well as Dr. Elizabeth Phillips, a neuroscientist, they looked at the results and fed those results back to each participant. What was remarkable was that each participant showed improvement, significant improvement in their mental health scores. So we know that when you eat your bread as part of a lifestyle medicine approach, and that is long, slow fermented, whole grain bread, then you see improvements. But you see, that is where it's very complex. Unfortunately, we are unable to lock up participants and only feed them one bread for weeks and weeks on end to see what happens, much as I would consider doing that. So how on earth can we possibly justify using sourdough as a way to deliver more nourishment to the gut microbiome, and how does it actually work? What are the mechanics, proven and unproven, of sourdough and the impact or potential impact on the gut and our mental health? So let me go through these with you. So these are in no particular order, but I'm going to start with a favourite of mine, and that is IBS. Irritable bowel syndrome is not one illness, but a collection of many different symptoms. It's very difficult to be absolutely sure that someone has IBS, but it's an umbrella term. And occasionally what we also find is that people consider non-celiac gluten sensitivity to also come under this umbrella of symptoms that show digestive discomfort. Now, there are dozens of different reasons that someone can have IBS. It could be stress, it could be related to FODMAPs, which are fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. In other words, fruit sugars, particularly in wheat, for example. The fructans in there can actually really, get your gut excited, and it can be very uncomfortable. And in your gut, there are more neurons in your gut, according to some studies, than there are in your cat's brain. And if you've ever met my cat, you will know that that means that your gut is pretty clever. And constantly there is an up-down relationship going on with your vagus nerves. Your microbes, 100 trillion of them, are considered to be listening to you. This kind of exchange of knowledge and information on your system is what we evolved with. It's a primitive system, and it goes on well every second of the day without us having to think about it. Now, IBS is also exacerbated by phytic acid, and we know that as the dough acidifies, that the phytases are triggered, and phytases are like Edward Scissorhands there. Those phytases are going to neutralize the phytic acid. Now, why does this help people with IBS? Well, you see, the phytic acid is essentially, phosphorus. It's a way of giving the seed a little bit of a woof to get going, but that same little bit of a woof is what you'll get with wind and digestive discomfort, because if you have IBS, then often that phytic acid is actually will give you gas and bloating. And if you neutralize that phytic acid, then you often find people who struggle with IBS will report that they can digest their bread more easily. What's also incredibly interesting about phytic acid is it has a chelating capacity. Now that means that it just grabs hold of everything. So it's going to go, I'm going to have a little bit of this mineral, a little bit of that. So it grabs the iron, the manganese, the copper, the zinc, and it just holds it all in because its job is to nourish the emerging plant. And it will also do that in your gut. So the thing is, there are studies that show that unfermented whole grain means you will literally poop out 80% of the micronutrients. Whereas it's the absolute opposite, inverse, that will happen with bread that is fermented. So by fermenting your bread, you're actually neutralizing an anti-nutrient, and you're also facilitating what we call more bioavailability of the minerals and of the vitamins. And there are also several studies as well that show that you will get more bioavailability, and these, I'm afraid, are in vitro and in animal studies as well. So kind of think of it not as being a human, but like a mechanical gut, if you want to think of it that way. And that means that a lot of the ferulic acid is unlocked as the grain acidifies. The acidification allows us to access more of those antioxidants, and that means that it is potentially cancer protective. There are many, many epidemiological studies that will show that eating whole grain is associated with multiple benefits on a population scale. So you've got reduced levels of Alzheimer's disease, you've got reduced levels of bowel cancer, and I think that, again, looking at the fermentation and its potential to unlock that has to be considered by the industrial bread makers, because, well, that's change on a population scale if we can get that, or should I say when we get that, to a system that allows us to deliver that to all bread. So coming back to potentially cancer protective, eating whole grain is part of the picture, but actually increasing the fermentation is the key to unlocking that potential. So your bread at this point has got mechanisms for reducing IBS symptoms, also mechanisms with bioactive peptides. At this point, again, the studies are potentially going to give more protection with the bioactive peptides than some of the current dairy products on the market, and that's saying something. So that, I believe, needs investigating a lot further. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity, very interesting to look at the acidification, the impact on the proteins and the degradation of proteins, glutenins and gliadins, and the impact of that on the immune system. The theory behind that is that when you have dysbiosis and your villi and your tight junctions, which are almost like the bits where your proteins can get through, are vulnerable, a little bit like having eczema, okay, in your digestive system. Those proteins are damaged. And your immune system, well, it's on the lookout for a particular protein that's a particular shape. And if the fermentation has damaged the protein, well, your immune system's like, yeah, I don't recognize you. It's not a problem. So you're simultaneously delivering fibre to allow, and very likely this bioavailability of the fibre is potentially going to be increasing the production of that butyric acid, which is a liner. So you can see already that if you're lining your gut with this lovely, slimy, short-chain fatty acids, and you're damaging the protein, well, that tuna sandwich that you had for lunch is just going to swing through your gut, doing some good stuff, instead of delivering, at best, no protein, and instead of delivering fibre and nutrition that is going to support the gut. It's highly likely that by fermenting it, your sandwich is going to nourish you a lot more. Touching on your sandwich for lunch, we also know that for many people, and this is really individual because everybody's gut microbiome works differently, I would suggest having a look at perhaps Tim Spector's work with Zoe Project, and you will see that each person has a different gut microbiome and assimilates carbohydrates differently. So with that fermentation, you're not only acidifying the dough, which slows down the, the rate at which something here is called the duodenum empties, which can actually slow down the rate at which your blood gets the sugar. The fibre also slows it down, but also the way that the fermentation changes the structure of the dough, puts in these longer chains, resistant starch. And the word resistant, it means it's resistant to being digested. And again, that can help slow down the rate of assimilation of carbohydrates. That's got to be a good thing. Spikes in blood sugar, absolutely irrefutable evidence that that drives inflammation. And, you know, inflammation day in, day out has been connected through the gut to all non-communicable diseases, autoimmune diseases, and also, you know, including Alzheimer's, known as, for some people, the third form of diabetes. So you can see now, if you actually build up that picture of slow fermentation, a picture emerges that is very clear. All people involved in making bread should be considering the impact of the way that they make their bread and eat their bread on not just their own health, but also on the health of the people they feed. Don't dismiss sourdough yet, because I think there's a lot more work to be done on it. And I look forward to seeing many of the scientists who have done incredible work so far take a much closer look at a process that we evolved with, and that I believe is symbiotic, not just with the planet, but also symbiotic with our own gut microbiome, and has the potential on a population scale to improve both physical and mental health in our most basic of food. So I'll leave you with my last thought and consideration about why I am so passionate about the bread that we eat every day. And that is because what we eat and how we eat it impacts the function of our gut microbiome. And it is our gut microbiome that manufactures the metabolites that make our brains function. And without fibre, well, our microbes simply cannot make what's needed. And no amount of antidepressants and no amount of therapy and no amount of hope is going to give a person the ability to function correctly. And you know what? We get one shot. You get one life. And I believe that the air that we breathe and the water we drink and the bread that we eat should be nourishing, so that we can each have that opportunity to live the most beautiful and impactful life possible. And I believe that sourdough and fermentation is absolutely key to doing that. That's it.